Sometime last year, I was at my local Dollar Tree looking through the movies they had. Sometimes you'll see something good in there that just didn't sell for whatever reason at some other store, but for the most part it's bottom-of-the-barrel money laundering schemes. I wanted to make a series on these craptastic films passed over by more sensible people, and I laid eyes on something magical. It had to wait for two reasons. One, my state had massive wildfires that threw off my personal life for a while, and two, it was a Christmas movie. Well, the holiday season is here, so it is with great displeasure I give the first episode of what is tentatively titled Tales from the Bargain Bin, featuring Christmas with a capital C, where Mr. Darcy from Married with Children tries to stop the vampire Daniel Baldwin from eating all the uppercase C's, thus removing Christmas from its rightful place as a proper noun. Yes, I'm joking, but only a little. By the way, this movie was made by Pureflix, the same studio that made God's Not Dead, so strap in. We start with an aerial shot of some snow-covered mountains, probably so we can bask in God's creation or some shit, I don't know. From a practical sense, this shows that the main character owns a tourism business, but honestly it has next to no bearing on the plot, so I won't be mentioning it again. What I will say is that these non-speaking mountains are the most well-written characters in the movie. The first dialogue we hear sounds something like, "Big Doug humming up to here, big Mr. Boss come spring."
Big trucks coming up through here. Be a mess of potholes come spring.
I can't actually blame the movie for this because I personally have a tendency to not understand what people are saying. Things often sound like gibberish until I've had a second to process it. But it did feel like a bad portent of things to come. But the hubbub is over moving trucks, which are there because the movie strawman atheist Mitch Bright is moving back to his hometown for the holidays. He stops by to talk to his old school rival and now mayor Dan Reed while they're putting up the town's nativity scene. Dan is weirdly hostile towards Mitch, but I can let that slide as in addition to all manner of extracurricular activities, they apparently also competed over Dan's wife. But still, Mitch is the quote villain of this movie, and his introduction is just small talk and saying that high school stuff is ancient history.
I thought maybe I'd come back and check out the old place, see some of my old friends. Hey, how's Kristen doing?
Here it comes.
She's good. Our kids are good, too.
Hey, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just being polite. Look, we're not in high school anymore, Dan.
I think it would have been better if we had seen him give a smirk as he drove up and then switch to a fake smile. Dan goes home and talks about this run-in with his wife Kristen, but before we go further, I want to focus on Dan's brother, Greg. Greg is a total nutcase. The movie portrays him as such. He is written to be a crazy, kooky character, but the problem is he's clearly the mouthpiece for the studio, as nothing he says is something they don't clearly believe. And considering that he is a stand-up comedian whose material is the ultimate source for this film, it's kinda hard to argue against. But we'll touch on him more later. Trust me.
We have such sights to show you.
We also have a very thin subplot where Dan's son Cody is clearly interested in a girl named Sienna who's giving him mixed signals, and he is debating whether to participate in some ski race. His subplot feels weird to me because it's a Christian movie trying to portray sexual tension between teenagers, which just never turns out right. Dan's other kid is a little girl named Michaela who's going to be an angel in some Christmas show. Dan and Cody have a little father-son talk about their problems, and it then cuts to evil vampire atheist Mitch, who ominously offers some ideas to a coffee shop owner on how to improve business. Since he's the God-hating atheist, his ideas must be really evil and anti-God, right? No, not really. They're actually pretty bland ideas, actually, but you'll see later. Cut from that to Greg telling Dan about how he loves Christmas because it's the only time in the year when the whole world is united under peace and brotherhood or something. I would just skip over how he's ignoring massive chunks of Earth's population who do not care about Christmas, but it should be mentioned how this movie holds two simultaneous views. Christians are an oppressed minority, and little towns like this are the last bastion of freedom of religion, and everyone is a Christian, and it's nonsensical to imagine anyone not being a Christian. More on that later. The main purpose of this scene is Dan telling Greg that his wife invited Mitch over for dinner because it's the Christian thing to do. Honestly, as far as Christians go, she and their daughter are okay characters who seem to actually practice what they preach. The dinner starts with the end of dinner. Seriously, this is the first line of the scene.
You know, I wasn't arguing about your policies. It's more your approach.
I don't know why they decided to show only the second half of the conversation. Maybe because Mitch makes too much sense when you give him too much screen time, and they can't have that. Mitch is kind of rude, but ultimately all he says is that the world is bigger than this town, and it's nicer and more loving than they think, even though it's not Christian. He claims that a large portion of the town finds Dan's religious piety annoying, and drops the idea that he'll be running for mayor. This is one of those straw man atheist scenes though, because although he's probably right, there isn't anything to judge the statement by. We don't get to see Dan preaching to the townsfolk or anything. All we got was him building the stage for the nativity scene with his brother. It would help if they had shown a scene where the town was at least a little bit resistant to his religiosity.
Happy birthday to you!
And now, let us pray.
Then they could have a scene at the end where they change their minds about him. Standard writing practices, you know. But his entire faith seems to be centered around Christmas decorations. We'll skip ahead to Dan at his office being informed that a complaint has been made by Mitch about the nativity scene, and so any work to put it up must be halted until a ruling from the judge just before Christmas. This is where the movie's plot really starts up. Dan immediately makes a comparison to The Grinch, which is funny to me because much like Ted Cruz signing copies of Green Eggs and Ham, these people clearly do not understand what The Grinch was about, because at no point does he file a complaint with City Hall because they put a Ten Commandments statue in front of the courthouse. After that is a rant from Greg where he treats it like the problem is that a child might see baby Jesus, but the problem, as this movie will clearly point out several times, is that you can't use tax dollars to pay for displays that give preferential treatment to a religion. This is exactly why the Church of Satan exists and why it's important. Just recently, when abortion rights were being stripped, they moved to have abortions considered a part of their religious rituals and therefore a protected act. There's also this part of his rant.
Invention, right? Well, let me tell you something, brother. Thinking we're Christians. Christians happen to have started the United States of America. And if
This is just not true. Some founding fathers were Christian, sure, but their total beliefs were varied and sometimes plainly anti-Christian. So Dan has a meeting with the city council, who are all very worried about the legal costs of this. They debate changing the old Merry Christmas sign, and Coffee Shop Lady defends Mitch a bit, saying he has some good business ideas. Dan promises to work things out with him because this is really between them, and with an uncomfortable teen romance interlude, things then move to Dan meeting Mitch at the coffee shop, who is discussing the potential for cruise ships to visit the town to see the local glacier. This scene is bizarre because pretty much everything Mitch says is just true, but we're supposed to side against him.
Oh, you'd be wrong about that.
Really?
Because I do have a problem with Christmas. As I do with Jesus and God and all the rest of the garbage you Christians have been jamming down my throat since I was a kid. You so-called Christians who are celebrating the birth of their Savior are the same people cussing me over a parking spot at the mall. Why? Because Jesus is coming, so we better rush on down and get ourselves a good deal on a flat screen TV before they run out. I find that most of you followers are the most unforgiving, unloving, even bigoted people I've ever seen.
If we're already done a name calling.
In my experience, Christians are generally very hypocritical people who make little to no attempt to actually live by the word of their religion. But there's also the legal aspect, where there is just no debate. He's correct.
You cannot preach your religion, Dan.
No, but I'm still a citizen. And as a citizen, I have a First Amendment right to express my own beliefs.
But you do not have the right to spend the taxpayers' money to propagate them.
The only money I've spent is to take better care of town property.
Town property, which establishes a religion.
The one thing I take issue with is his attack on Christmas itself, because I promise you no sane atheist gives a flying fuck about Santa Day. It's basically stated that Mitch is officially deciding to run for mayor to challenge Dan, and the scene changes to Dan being super offended by the new season's greetings sign, as if he is in any way prohibited from saying Merry Christmas himself or hanging the old sign on his own property.
Happy winter, Joe. Merry snow falling, Davey. Don't put that on a sign. You might offend somebody.
There's a montage of people putting up opposing signs and bumper stickers, and I just want to hang on this Festivus for the rest of us sticker. There's nothing to say, I just think it's a funny reference to throw in. The movie gets 1 point.
The tradition of Festivus begins with the airing of grievances. I got a lot of problems with you people. Now, you're gonna hear about it.
After a pep talk from Kristen, we have a meltdown from Greg over the use of the phrase, "Happy Holidays," which is among the changes that Mitch suggested in an effort to make Coffee Lady's business more inclusive. Greg lists a bunch of holidays at this time of year and dismisses them as not being happy and important before landing on Christmas. Curiously, he doesn't acknowledge Hanukkah. I wonder why he, a devout Christian, might ignore the existence of a Jewish holiday that takes place over several days in the month of December. I'm sure it's nothing. An interesting thing to know, by the way, is that Happy Holidays is not a new greeting. It has been in use for over 100 years, and the word holiday has its origin in the word for holy day, which is obvious in hindsight. The point is that it has never been meant to erase Jesus, it's just a generic pleasantry. Anyway, his rant is recorded by Mitch and helps boost Mitch's support because, unsurprisingly, Greg just comes off looking like a crazy hobo. Moving ahead, we come to a scene where Greg has Michaela singing Christmas songs in her angel costume on city property, angering Mitch, who tries to get her to stop and calls the cops when Greg touches him. Now, let me be clear. In this scenario, Mitch is in the wrong. Barring any legal technicalities I'm unaware of, there is nothing legally stopping a little girl from singing religious songs unless the city is literally paying for the performance or giving her special treatment. But this is another incident where no one would actually care anyway. But here's the real issue. Whether he was technically in the right or not, Greg knew exactly what he was doing. He was using his niece, a child, as a pawn. I utterly detest people who do that shit, and technically that's happening on 2 layers because, obviously, she is a real little girl being cast in a movie that is just religious propaganda. Anyway, Greg and Michaela are back at the house and Kristen is scolding Greg over the event as once again she is a small beacon of rationality. Dan calls a meeting of his peers, including the local pastor, where he expresses distress over the idea that he would have to display imagery from other religions, as that is the only way the nativity scene would be allowed. The pastor says that Mitch hates all religions, that he hates God, so basically there would be no pleasing him. In the context of the movie that is true, but when speaking about the real atheists that Mitch represents, no, most of them do not hate God any more than they genuinely hate Voldemort. What they hate is the messaging of people who claim to speak for God. But the pastor actually lays down some real wisdom, declaring that at the end of the day the statues are just statues and shouldn't be idolized anyway. I am sorry to say that we now have come to the single worst part of the movie. It is one of the cringiest things I've ever seen, and you are lucky I can only show fragments of it. Cody tells Greg that he's not entering the ski race this year, and Sienna shows up to ask why he's not at practice. She gets invited in to watch while Michaela practices for her Christmas show. Cody calls it boring, and Greg jumps up to defend it and act out the scene as the Virgin Mary. This scene is supposed to be funny, but just watch.
Look at me, I'm just a girl trying not to step anywhere onto scorpions because I have no socks.
Do not be afraid. You have found favor with God. You will give birth to a child and call his name Jesus.
Is that right? Well, what in the world would she say? Actually, I'm not really good with this because, you see, I'm suddenly, pregnant without explanation, which means my fiance can kind of, officially stone me, which completely ruins my makeup. And my BFFs will, never speak to me again, so I really don't see that as God's favorite.
Thankfully, we get a brief reprieve from this while Kristen name-drops the movie and says that they are all focusing too much time on this dispute and not enough on people in need and being good Christians. It would be really nice if it wasn't for the fact that this thinking is not actually adhered to by the people who make these movies. Anyway, we have some more of Greg's Virgin Mary bit giving the baby Jesus to Sienna in a way that totally doesn't feel creepy as fuck. Kristen and them finish their conversation, and Greg praises how God humbled himself and became human to help humanity, instead of just, quote, showing up and freaking everyone out. Why God has to jump through these hoops is something no Christian ever has a proper answer for. Sometimes they'll say we can't behold him, much like how we can't bear to look at the sun, but he's God. He literally just has to think that he wants us to behold him without bursting into flames or going crazy, and then we'll be able to. That is the definition of all-powerful. Literally nothing is beyond his ability. But beyond that, the idea of God humbling himself is ludicrous. I thought one of the few things Christians and atheists were in agreement on was that God is a massive egotist with huge jealousy issues. He literally made angels for the sole purpose of praising him. It's like if you were to play a looping recording of yourself talking about how great you are. But sure, by setting up a needlessly convoluted event where he can talk yet more about how awesome he is, he was humbling himself. Anyway, Sienna blackmails Cody into racing in exchange for not telling anyone about this horrific event, and we get another montage of everyone spreading Christmas cheer using a capital C as a symbol. Greg also dials back his crazy just a little bit to apologize to his crush, the coffee shop girl, for standing on her chairs and making a scene. Michaela decides to make capital C cookies and wants to deliver some to Mitch to be nice, but he isn't home, so she leaves them at the door and prays for him that night. But can we just look at this scene where she's jumping on the bed?
How many Christmas cookies did you have tonight?
Only got 7. Only got 7.
What was that? Did they dub in the word 7? Why? And why didn't they choose the number 8, which would have fit the mouth movement better? It's so immediately noticeable. I mean, I get it, this seems to be a small production and maybe there was a problem with her mic or something, I don't know. But they had to have realized how jarring that was, right? It's time for the ruling now, and although the judge makes it clear she doesn't like having to do this, she offers Dan 3 perfectly reasonable options.
I mean, you could add to this as a holiday display and include elements of a non-religious nature or elements that are of other faiths. Or the city can donate or sell them, the statues and the platform, to a private individual who can display them in another place, either on private property or with permission in a public setting where there is equal opportunity for others to put up their own holiday displays. And the third, don't display them at all.
Dan considers each one of these as ruining the town's traditions because he is a whining crybaby. For the love of God, just put them up on your own property. Or hell, just put up a Hanukkah display alongside it. This isn't your money. This isn't your property. It's the city's. And I'm sure that even in a town as small as theirs, there is at least one taxpayer who has a different belief system than you. Thankfully, the judge calls him out on this.
I mean, moving the Christ child to another place of honor does no harm to his reputation. Perhaps you are more concerned about yours.
Next, Pothole Guy is shown complaining about the tourism Mitch wants to bring, but changes his mind at the prospect of some hot old widows. Mitch gloats over Dan and is then shown in his seemingly cold, empty house. This scene weirdly comes just before the reveal, where Michaela says that when she was delivering the cookies, she saw that Mitch has hardly any possessions. Curious to figure out what's going on in Mitch's life, Dan and Greg fly over to his firm and ask about him. They discover he no longer works there, and the guy they're talking to praises how nice Mitch was and gives them some money to give him. Later, when Dan is telling Kristen about the situation, Cody comes to ask for advice about Sienna. To paraphrase this whole scene, "The girl is competitive with me, why that? Dumb boys don't understand girls. Girl-like boy!" The funny part is that Dan tells him to look past the competition and see the person and all that. But this could almost be interpreted to mean Mitch has the hots for Dan? I mean, I couldn't blame him. Back in the Married with Children days, his whole character was being a sexy boy toy who married for money.
I feel just like I did when I was a little boy and my father said, "Shake it, son, and the women will pay."
And in this movie, which came out around 2010, he's so far aged pretty well. Next is the big ski race I don't care about, where Sienna wins. People start worrying about the cruise ship Mitch promised not showing up, and he comes to Dan to tell him that his contact canceled. He also reveals he was always jealous of Dan and Greg, because of course he was. That night, the church is putting on its play, and Dan leaves to give Mitch the money from his old co-worker. By the way, the fact that this was shown as a dilemma for even a second is strange to me. If they kept the money, they would have been stealing from Mitch. It's not a complex issue. Just leave it in an unmarked envelope if you need to. But everyone from church shows up in tow to give him housewarming gifts, and it's all nice and sappy. The next day, Dan and Greg are putting up the display in a legal way, but Mitch comes by to tell them he stopped the injunction preventing them from doing the display, and also gives them a copy of the email he got from his cruise line contact proving that although it was delayed, he was being serious about it. That's pretty much it. The credits have bloopers and some stand-up from Brad Stein, who played Greg, but I didn't really bother going through all that. The bit I saw from Brad was a part of his stand-up routine where he complains about the phrase Happy Holidays, and that right there is why this movie is garbage. You might think, Jess, what is there to complain about? Mitch doesn't convert to Christianity, Dan puts aside the dispute over the nativity scene, and his wife openly says that these squabbles are meaningless in comparison to behaving like a proper Christian. The problem is that I know what I'm being paid lip service.
You sit on a throne of lies.
The people making this movie don't believe in a goddamn word they said. They just want to be able to point to these scenes and say, look, see, we're reasonable, so they can go back to making up stories about teachers being fired for mentioning Jesus. Hell, Mitch stopped the injunction, but that's not a good thing. It's still a matter of local government favoring a religion and using tax dollars to pay for it. This movie is ultimately just thinly veiled propaganda, and I'm glad that the pile of other bargain bin movies I have aren't from PureFlix, because then I can at least just be mortified by their terrible quality instead of angry at their fake sincerity. Oh, and one more thing. I changed my mind and decided to look at the credits a little more because this movie is based on a song, and as much as I wanted to avoid it at all costs, I had to give it a listen. Brace yourselves.
Coffee shop to get myself a mocha. The lady at the counter said, Happy Holidays.